Today at the National Press Club, in the first of our telecasts for 1995, the American philosopher and commentator Noam Chomsky. He's internationally known for his policy and the media, and his outspoken advocacy of human rights. We cross now to the National Press Club in Canberra.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club for this first occasion in 1995. As you just heard, our guest today for the National Press Club telecom address is Professor Noam Chomsky. To describe him just as a professor of linguistics would be to understate the case. In a month where visitors to Australia, accepting that it's the northern winter, have included the Pope and Bill Gates, he's had, as you would have undoubtedly noticed, more publicity than probably the other two combined, which is a very healthy sign given that he deals in a range of issues so close to the very basis of public policy making in the Western democratic type of system. Given all that too, he needs no further introduction. Please join us in welcoming Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss some current issues with you. There are many that come to mind that are urgent and pressing. Time is short, and I want to keep to one. The one that's surely a shared concern, and one, in fact, on which we have a kind of special relationship, though there's no way for the Australian press to know that. The special relationship is that when I became involved seriously in the issue of East Timor about almost 20 years ago, virtually the only source of information was Australia, and I was relying very extensively on material that I got from here, from friends, from people like Jim Dunn, who's here, and others, when I testified at the United Nations or was able finally to write about it or give talks about it and so on. That aside, the issue is a very timely one. It's one of great human significance, and it also is, in a certain sense, a kind of microcosm of the basic principles of world order and international law on which any hope for a decent future rests. I am, of course, talking about the issue of East Timor. At stake is the fate of people who have suffered miserably and still do, people to whom Australia, as you know, owes a unique debt, and crucially at stake are the fundamental principles of world order, the obligation of all states, the prohibition against the use of force in international affairs, and the inalienable right of self-determination. The issue takes on added importance right now because I think it may well be at a turning point, possibly a decisive one, and also because it's so easily resolved in comparison to other much thornier problems of international affairs. It doesn't mean it's trivial, but it's not Bosnia, it's not even Rwanda. I mean, one can think of easy ways of ending it. In the early years, late 70s, the decisive role in supporting the crimes, and they were serious crimes, was that of the United States, both military aid and diplomatic support. That's changed over the years. By now, it's substantially changed. As you know, the popular pressures and congressional pressures have led to the point that Congress has actually initiated some restrictions. I mean, they're not enormous in scale, but symbolically they're very significant, and restrictions against training of Indonesian officers and arms sales. Britain has seized the opportunity and taken over the lead in enriching itself through the bloodshed there, and I was greeted at the Sydney airport with the headline that Australia wants to follow suit, selling rifles to Indonesia now that the United States has finally backed off from that particular partnership in crime. The basic facts of the matter are simple and well known to all of you. They're about as clear as anything is in international affairs. The Indonesian invasion of 1975 was an unprovoked act of aggression, a war crime. It was immediately condemned by the General Assembly. The Security Council unanimously called upon Indonesia to withdraw its forces without delay and called upon all states to respect the territorial integrity of Timor as well as the inalienable rights of its people to self-determination, and endorsed the call of the General Assembly for urgent action. Well, that position had a very firm basis in international law, and I want to say a few words about it, but with a qualification. I'm not really concerned here with the technicalities, and I don't have any illusions about our living under a world of law. We live under a world of force. But nevertheless, the principles are important. I think the principle, however, whatever the technicalities, that international lawyers feel like arguing about, the principles are clear, explicit, significant. They're the kind of principles to which decent people should be committed, in my opinion, and they're the principles on which they should hold their governments to account. That's the only way in which it's possible to move towards a more decent world. Well, these UN resolutions on East Timor, immediate UN resolutions, and the obligation that they impose on all states, remember, they merely affirm the language of two critically important resolutions that were adopted unanimously by the UN General Assembly in 1970 and 1974, the so-called Friendly Relations Declaration and the Declaration on Aggression. And they were quite explicit and unequivocal. They stated that no territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal, and that no special advantage resulting from aggression shall be recognized as lawful. In both cases, the word was shall, not should, which means it's an obligation. The application of these decisions to the case of the Indonesian invasion shortly after was merely automatic. I mean, they just spelled out the meaning of those resolutions for that particular case, and it was so recognized by the UN Security Council with its call on all states to uphold the principles of international law that they had just so ringingly affirmed. Now, these are not ordinary resolutions. The Friendly Declarations resolution in particular has a uniquely important status in international law, and that's repeatedly been affirmed. It was adopted, as I'm sure you know, on the 25th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations after years of careful drafting. The government of Australia, much to its credit, took a very active role throughout and indeed co-sponsored the final draft. Australia had an official position, which was that the declaration does not amend the UN Charter, the fundamental treaty obligation of all states, but rather, in the words of Australia, elaborate some of its most important principles concerning the use of force and the right of self-determination. Australia officially described the declaration as a contribution to the progressive development and codification of international law, quoting from the UN Charter. Now, this very principled position that Australia took in the early 70s has repeatedly been affirmed. There's no time to go through the details, but it's been affirmed, for example, by the World Court several times. The World Court, in fact, singled out the Friendly Relations Declaration with the wording that I quoted as demonstrating that the treaty obligation of the UN Charter to abstain from threat and use of force has, in the words of the World Court, binding force as customary international law and accepted as valid by all states that endorsed the declaration, notably Australia, giving its leading role. Side comment. This decision was in the case of U.S. versus Nicaragua, which reveals very clearly just what kind of a world we live in. The World Court condemned the United States for its unlawful use of force, that is, war crime and illegal economic warfare, and called for reparations. But the biggest mafia don doesn't bother with such things, and the United States just kicked them in the face. The reaction was complete dismissal, total hostility. The press dismissed the World Court as a hostile forum that had discredited itself and so on. That's the real world, but I'm talking about the principles. In any event, in the U.S. versus Nicaragua case, again, the World Court affirmed the Friendly Relations Declaration, the crucial one, the wording I quoted, as the basis for as binding on all states as international law. Well, without just a last example, there's many others. That declaration, with all of that wording, gains further force, which is directly applicable to the present case, from the 1974 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, also endorsed by Australia with no reservations. It declares a treaty void if it conflicts with international law, and the International Law Commission that drafted the convention, again, singled out the Friendly Relations Declaration, the one I quoted, as the basis for determining when a treaty is void, and subsequent commentary has done so as well. Well, it seems easy enough to figure out what all of this entails about a treaty that's based on the acquisition of territory by force and the denial of the inalienable right of self-determination that shouldn't strain the intelligence of a, say, 12-year-old, and in particular one that offers special advantage to its signatories in violation of the fundamental principles of law that Australia, in fact, had been instrumental in advancing. Well, I know of only one such treaty anywhere that so dramatically and explicitly violates those principles. It's the treaty that was implemented by the Australian Parliament in 1990, which you know all about. If there's another one in the world, I don't know it. In brief, the issue of war crimes seems about as clear as such things ever are, and the obligation of all states to refrain from endorsing them or gaining special advantage from them seems about as clear as one can find. In fact, it's hardly possible to find a clearer case to determine whether international law and world order mean anything at all beyond their use as weapons to beat official enemies. And we can test that, and the results of the experiment they're well known and not very pretty, and I won't run through them, time being brief. Let me turn rather to Australia's official stand on these matters. And here I have to say right off that I'm no expert on Australia's foreign policy. In fact, I don't know anything about it. So you'll have to pardon me if I use secondary sources. And the natural place to look is the 1991 treatise, Australia's Foreign Policy, co-authored by Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, which I presume is an authoritative guide, so I'll take that as a guide. He writes that Australia has always taken its international responsibilities very seriously. Once we subscribe to a treaty, we abide by its requirements in every detail, unlike other more negligent states, he says. And that this is indeed Australia's public stand is underscored quite dramatically by its very principled role in spelling out the obligations of all states to oppose the acquisition of territory by force, to defend the inalienable right of self-determination, and to refuse to gain any special advantage from such illegal acts. Again, Australia was in the lead in establishing these fundamental principles of world order. And Australia's official commitment to these high principles was reiterated forcefully by Prime Minister Hawke, who declared that, in his words, all nations should know that the rule of law must prevail over the use of force in international relations. Big countries cannot invade small neighbors and get away with it. And thanks to the virtuous Anglo-Americans, he went on, the weak will feel secure from attack. All of this in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, which Senator Evans very properly denounced as naked, indefensible aggression by a strong, ruthless, and ambitious sovereign country over a weaker neighbor. Very principled. With this background, which I've only barely mentioned, it goes on very much like this. With this background, one can only be perplexed to read on in the Foreign Minister's treatise on Australian foreign relations to see what happens when we go to from principle to fact. So there is nothing in it about the norms of international law that Australia played such a prominent role in establishing as the treaty obligations of all states. Apparently all of that is somehow irrelevant to Australian foreign policy, which was the topic of the book. Anyway, it's not mentioned. Nor is there a word about the application of these high principles of international law to the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, as expressed unanimously by the UN Security Council, merely applying the exact principles, the fundamental principles of international law that Australia had played such a prominent role in establishing. In fact, there's only a few sentences on the whole topic. There's one sentence that mentions the de jure recognition of the annexation by Australia. Recall that that's the same government that, advocating the same high principles of international law, revoked the recognition of the annexation of the Baltic states. There is a single phrase in the book about, I'll quote it, the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1975, when the military moved with less than decent haste to take the place of the hastily departed Portuguese colonialists, with 5 Australian journalists killed in the process in some unspecified way, and another one apparently disappearing somehow. That's it. That's the full discussion of that topic. The problem, notice, was the less than decent haste, which was kind of embarrassing, not the crime of aggression or the crimes against humanity or the behavior of the accessories, who are always ready with uplifting rhetoric when it serves the needs of power. Well, that's the discussion of that topic in Australia's foreign policy. Going from the book to the jacket cover, it's graced with warm words by Indonesian Foreign Minister Ali Alatas for what he says, my good friend and colleague, Gareth Evans. And as the book was going to press, the Australian Parliament endorsed the Timor Gap Treaty that had just been signed by the author and his good friend and colleague. The treaty arranged for the two parties to divide up the spoils of Indonesia's armed conquest, the potentially rich oil reserves of a country that could not be economically self-sufficient, we're informed with a straight face by the robbers, and therefore has no right to self-determination and protection from aggression, whatever international law and the United Nations might declare. The Timor Gap Treaty, which I stress again is the only treaty in international affairs to my knowledge which radically, explicitly, and unequivocally violates everything to which Australia is fundamentally committed, as are other states. The Timor Gap Treaty offers nothing to the people of what it calls the Indonesian province of East Timor, whose resources are being stolen by the criminal and the accessory. And recall again that Australia is committed to the principle that treaties are void if they conflict with the obligations of all states enunciated in the UN Charter, which were spelled out under Australia's lead in the Friendly Relations Declaration, binding on all states and declaring illegal any acquisition of territory by force, applied immediately afterwards to the Indonesian invasion by the Security Council. Now, whatever the World Court may decide in the next couple of weeks, the Timor Gap Treaty definitively rejects everything that Australia stands for, according to the Foreign Minister and the official stands of the Australian government for many years. And technicalities aside, I think those are the things that people ought to be concerned about. The Evans study of Australian foreign relations does mention the Timor Gap Treaty. It is mentioned as, here's the sole mention, it is an example of a non-military solution to a problem that historically has often led to conflict. Well, putting aside the transparent facts, you'll recall, I'm sure, Ambassador Woolcot's secret cable of August 1975, during the period when Australia was pretending it didn't know about the invasion. The cable advised that Australia approve the impending invasion because favorable arrangements to gain a share of East Timor's oil, I'm quoting, could be more readily negotiated with Indonesia than with Portugal or an independent Portuguese Timor. Shortly after, Michael Richardson reported here that Indonesia was prepared to offer Australia generous terms in exchange for recognition of the Indonesian invasion. all paving the way to an exemplary contribution to world order, an example of a non-military solution. Well, all in all, that's a pretty stunning performance. You'd have to work to find a parallel to that. I mean, you can find it in Henry Kissinger's book on diplomacy and so on, but there aren't many examples of that kind. In parliamentary debate, the foreign minister, as you know better than I, has explained his position more fully, stating that, I'm quoting, "there is no binding legal obligation not to recognize the acquisition of territory that was acquired by force. So much for the Friendly Relations Declaration, which states, no territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal," wording affirmed by the World Court as a binding legal obligation on all states, and understood by Australia to be a mere elaboration of the meaning of the UN Charter, the basic treaty obligation of all states and the foundation, such as it is, for world order. Senator Evans also declared that the legal status of the Friendly Relations Declaration has long been hotly contested. That was 9 years ago. And for the last 9 years, legal scholars have been diligently searching for some illustration of this hot contest. The claim has been challenged in leading journals of international law, and as far as I can determine, nobody's been able to find any illustration of it or evidence for it yet, so we still await the evidence. He also elaborated further, I'm quoting Senator Evans, that the world is a pretty unfair place, littered with examples of acquisition by force, so acquisition by force may therefore be recognized freely by those who hope to gain special advantage thereby. So, for example, it should not have troubled us unduly if Libya had signed a treaty with Iraq to divide up Kuwait's oil, since the world's an unfair place, after all. In the same breath as in which the foreign minister said this, he banned official contacts with the PLO because, in his words, because of its consistently defending and associating itself with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Although he didn't accuse the PLO of granting official recognition to a gross violation of the Friendly Relations Declaration, and he didn't accuse the PLO of entering into an arrangement to gain special advantage from it by gaining a share of Kuwait's oil reserves. Well, I'm sure that any competent law student from ANU can show that all of this is a perfect model of consistency. And right now, no doubt, skilled counsel is doubtless preparing to do just that at the World Court. After all, that's what the profession's about. But as I mentioned, I'm not interested in that now. I'm interested in a different topic, namely what guides the acts of the powerful, how these are served up to the general public, and what stand a human being should take as a citizen of a democratic society. Well, after all of this, it's sort of refreshing to turn to a straightforward, honest account of what's going on. So let me do that. The best I know, in fact, is Ambassador Richard Woolcot's August 1975 cable that I quoted before. In it, he recommended what he called Kissingerian realism. That's a technical term for thuggishness and criminality when you can get away with it. He advocated what he called a pragmatic rather than a principled stand with regard to the forthcoming Indonesian invasion, which everyone pretended they didn't know about, because he said that's what national interest and foreign policy is all about. Well, the Woolcot doctrine neatly cuts through all of the Gordian knots. There are no problems, no inconsistencies, no need for further casuistry once all principles have been completely abandoned, and it is frankly acknowledged that the powerful do what they like, acting with Kissingerian realism. And that position, in my opinion at least, is far preferable to the self-congratulatory rhetoric that's intended for the public. With regard to the Woolcot doctrine, I do have only one recommendation, however. The phrase national interest is a residual Orwellism that should be removed. We should, by now, I think, be able to bring ourselves to comprehend a fact about the world that was considered a truism by Adam Smith, who observed that the principal architects of state policy in his day, the merchants and manufacturers of England, use state power to ensure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including their domestic population. Well, he didn't live long enough, Adam Smith, to become familiar with subsequent cultivated usage in which the term national interest has been invented as the newspeak designation for the special interests of those whose domestic power allows them to craft state policy for their own ends. And this qualification about national interest isn't just academic, it's quite real. There may well be Australians who feel that Timor's petroleum smells better than Timorese blood and tears, in the bitter words of the Timorese priest who chronicled the horrible Kraras massacre of 1983. But as you know better than I, there are plenty of Australians who would reject that concept of the national interest with contempt and outrage. And many of them have been quite outspoken about it in the press, in journals, and elsewhere. So Michel Turner's oral history gives very eloquent examples and forceful ones of people who recall the blood debt, which you all know about, I don't have to tell you, and the subsequent betrayal, as they call it, and don't like it. That aside, most Australians surely would not accept the pragmatic concept of national interest of the Woolcot doctrine, and that's precisely why it's articulated in secret and why such efforts were made to silence it after it surfaced. The fact that government secrecy is largely motivated by fear of democracy becomes very evident when one plows through declassified records, and it's well known to diplomatic historians, I should say, even though it's not considered polite to say it. The U.S. State Department has a historical advisory committee which supervises declassification under the 30-year rule and so on, pretty conservative bunch. They just wrote a couple of months ago, they wrote a formal letter to the Secretary of State objecting to the violations of the 30-year rule on declassification. This is a practice that was initiated by Reaganite statist reactionaries who believed that the increasingly powerful state that they were nurturing should be protected from any public scrutiny. When they did it, the whole board resigned in protest, but now it's happening again under Clinton. A couple of months ago, the new reconstituted committee wrote a letter to the Secretary of State in which they said that the refusal to declassify material derives from fear of embarrassment rather than national security, and they could have added that the secrecy largely serves that function in the first place. I don't think anyone who's actually taken the trouble to go through declassified records, as I have, can have any doubt about that. You very rarely find anything of security concern. Apart from the interest of people everywhere in living up to the ideals that are impressively intoned when some advantage is to be gained thereby, just what are the great costs to the national interest in the technical sense if Australia decides to adhere to its obligations under international law and elementary justice? Well, Ambassador Woolcot did mention one, which apparently was decisive for him. He suggested that Australia could make a more lucrative deal with Indonesia to exploit Timor's oil resources than with an independent East Timor. So let's say that's true. But what is an independent East Timor going to do with its oil? I assume they're not going to drink it. As everyone knows, in fact, they're going to call on exactly the same oil companies, possibly on slightly different terms. But even on grounds of Kissingerian realism, are these sufficient grounds for Australia to take the lead in the world in endorsing and profiting from terrible crimes? Well, what about relations with Indonesia generally? Are they likely to suffer if Australia takes a quiet, dignified, principled stand? Australia and Indonesia have complementary socioeconomic systems, and that's a firm basis for interactions without the need to barter the lives of suffering people whose only crime is that they're small and weak. That brings me finally to the last point, and that's the question of Indonesia's national interest. Well, again, Adam Smith's truism is very much to the point. Which Indonesians are we talking about when we talk about supporting Indonesia? There's plenty of different ones. The interests of General Suharto and his family and his cronies are not the same as the interests of Indonesians who are struggling for freedom and justice. They're not the same as the interests of the labor leaders who were slapped into jail to clean the place up before the APEC conference, for example. The reason why the Indonesian government has imposed such harsh censorship on its exploits in Timor is the usual one, to protect itself from its own population. No one else is fooled unless they choose to be. The government feared, and rightly, that the people of Indonesia are likely to have the wrong concept of national interest, so therefore you got to keep them in ignorance. They might turn out to be less than happy with the fact that the budget needed by the armed forces for East Timor has drastically reduced the state budget allocated to education and health, quoting George Adijandro, citing scholarly studies, and the people of Indonesia are no less able to see the moral issues than Australians, which is why there have been so many protests in Indonesia once the facts began to seep through, including quite courageous and forthright demands by major student groups that for the sake of humanity and our common well-being, the government reconsider the fake process of integration in East Timor. They demanded further that Indonesia withdraw its forces and grant a full and free right of self-determination to the people of East Timor. It's a lot harder to issue a declaration like that in Indonesia than it is in Canberra, as I need not say. Such reactions inside Indonesia are a good part of that famous piece of gravel in the shoe that Foreign Minister Alatas took note of, and that his government might well remove to the relief of many Indonesians who have their own concept of the national interest. Well, it's been repeatedly argued here that Indonesia can't rid itself of the piece of gravel for fear of strengthening separatist movements or perhaps national honor. You'll notice, of course, that those are the same arguments that have been put forth to justify Russia's hold on the Baltic countries or its current vicious assault on Chechnya. Well, every case has to be looked at on its own merits. The arguments in the present case seem to me hardly impressive, to put it politely. In the present case, the proper role of outsiders is to try as much as possible to help the affected peoples gain the right and power to make their own decisions. And I mean the affected peoples, not their autocratic rulers, not foreign investors, or not what Adam Smith called the principal architects of policy in our own countries. The role of outsiders is certainly not to preempt that choice by firmly placing the boot on the necks of suffering people. It's also not the role of outsiders to affect a high moral tone, as when a Douglas Hurd, of all people, solemnly explains that we cannot export Western values on human rights to developing nations. Western values on human rights are something that the Third World has learned all about well enough, thank you, for several hundred years. As for denunciations of others for their crimes, there are not too many people and no institutions of power that have any moral right to take such a stance. My own view on these matters, for what it's worth, is that we should look primarily at ourselves. So, for example, in 1980, when the U.S. press finally did begin, after many disgraceful years, to give some recognition to what had happened in East Timor, the New York Times had a powerful editorial entitled "The Shaming of Indonesia." And I wrote a letter, which they wouldn't publish, although some NGOs did, suggesting that the title and the thrust of the editorial should have been "The Shaming of the United States," or actually what I had in mind is "The Shaming of the New York Times," although I didn't suggest that in the vain hope of passing through those august portals. We have our own crimes to consider in the case of East Timor, and not only there, major and critical ones, and we're hardly in any kind of position to issue a blanket condemnation of Indonesia, whose population had no way to find out what was going on and did not find out, with a few exceptions like George Adijandro, who surely needs no lectures from us. The point generalizes, and I won't elaborate, the implications seem obvious. Let me just end by reiterating something that also ought to be obvious. I've been speaking of one of the great crimes of the modern era, one of the crimes in which we have had and still have a crucial, indeed primary role, It's also one of the easier cases to resolve in world affairs. The piece of gravel can be removed, and we could help ease the way if we so choose. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I should just mention that the invitation to Professor Chomsky to tour Australia from the East Timorese support groups was supported by AMDAL and the Financial Review, as well as, in today's case, by our own sponsor, Telecom Australia. We move now to our usual period of media questions, and the first one today is from Bruce Juddery.
Bruce Juddery, freelance writer. Is that right for the microphone? All sorts of instructions on how to use it. I've got about 6 questions, but I'll satisfy myself with 2.
Okay.
It's nice to meet someone who's read leaks I've reported. But I'd like to ask you a philosophical question to start with. Is there not such a thing as raison d'etat? I know it sounds cold-blooded, but in the references to Kissingerian realism that you quoted from, as the person who transmitted them to the public, Dick Woolcot invariably counterpoised it with Wilsonian idealism, which of course has led us to Bosnia, a little bit further down the track, but it was inherent in the Wilsonian 14 points and so forth. Is there not such a thing as raison d'etat, in which a country that may be big in size lives alongside a country that's also big in size and damn sight more populous? Is it not justifiable, as no doubt Mr. Chamberlain and others thought in 1938, to indulge in a little bit of expedient appeasement? And perhaps
expedient what?
Appeasement.
Appeasement, yeah.
As I say, it's raison d'etat. You also take people out and torture them and do various other things, raison d'etat. Would you like to philosophise on that? And the second question is a purely factual one. We've been having a bit of an argument. 2 eminent organisations have given different versions of your nativity.
Of my?
Nativity.
Nativity? Yeah. I just met somebody who seems to be a relative. Maybe she
as I understand it, as I'm told, Encyclopedia Britannica says that you were born in Philadelphia in 1921.
No, 28. I'm not that old.
The Canberra Times says New York in 1928.
Sort of each or half right. Philadelphia in 1928.
Philadelphia in 28. Thank you.
Yeah, but Philadelphia, especially in those days, if those of you know the United States, was kind of like an overgrown suburb of New York. In fact, I often thought there's some sociological law, which no one has found yet, that you can't have 2 big cities that close to one another, because one of them will be a city and the other will be a suburb, no matter how big it is. However, so it's 1928 in Philadelphia, if anybody cares. On the question of raison d'etat and Wilsonian idealism, yeah, you're right. In fact, I only quoted half of that famous Woolcot cable, which ought to be taught in schools. He says that he advocates Kissingerian realism rather than Wilsonian idealism. Now, in my view, as actually there's an article of mine in The Age which mentions this, I find it very hard to distinguish Kissingerian realism from Wilsonian idealism. I think you need quite a fine microscope to distinguish them. The fact is, both of these are technical terms of Orwellian discourse. Kissingerian realism, as I said, is thuggishness and criminality when you can get away with it, and raison d'etat is another name for that. Kissingerian realism and raison d'etat are typically undertaken in secret, and they're undertaken in secret for a very good reason. Governments know that their populations will never accept it if they know what's being done in their name. Okay, that's Kissingerian realism and raison d'etat. Sure, it exists. In fact, that's all that exists in the international world, unless the population of countries calls their governments to account. The example of the U.S. and Nicaragua is a striking one. What's Wilsonian idealism? Well, it's one thing in the intellectual world where people prate about it. It's another thing in the real world where it was applied. And it was indeed applied. So Woodrow Wilson was the leading interventionist of the early 20th century. He, in his forces, invaded Haiti and the Dominican Republic, also Mexico and plenty of others. In Haiti and the Dominican Republic, they tore the place to shreds. They killed thousands of people, reinstituted slavery, eliminated the parliamentary system because they regarded it as unprogressive. In Haiti, the parliament refused to accept the U.S. written constitution, which allowed the alienation of Haitian land, meaning allowed American corporations to buy up Haiti and turn it into a plantation. These niggers, as the Wilson's administration called them, couldn't understand that that was progressive, and they therefore sent the Marines in to disband the Parliament by what Major Smedley Butler in charge called genuine Marine Corps methods, after which the United States ran a free election under Marine Corps supervision, in which they got 99.98% of the vote, with 5% of the population voting. Now, that's a typical. They also left behind. They reinstituted slavery. They left behind a murderous National Guard, which has been slaughtering the population ever since and still is. Same thing happened in the Dominican Republic, except they left Trujillo and his gangsters. That's Wilsonian idealism. In fact, even if you look at the famous 14 points, not the stuff they teach you in school, but the actual wording, you'll see that the famous 14 points have a reservation about people at a low level, I forget the exact wording, but something like people at a low level of civilization. I mean, it doesn't quite apply to them. They don't get self-determination. And it said in their case, meaning everybody in the third world, their rights have to be balanced against the rights of their traditional benefactors, like England and France and so on, in deciding how self-determination is realized. That's Wilsonian idealism. We should, in my view, put aside all of this nonsense and agree with Ambassador Woolcot. It is a rule. It's a world of force. It's in which the powerful do what they can get away with. And if they're very powerful, it's a lot. And in which it's a world in which it's the task of respectable intellectuals to put a nice gloss on this, with notions like Wilsonian idealism, which are somehow independent of the reality of what Wilson did or even said. So yes, there is definitely a raison d'etat, Kissingerian realism, and it's about 100% of the activity of states. There's rhetoric about Wilsonian idealism, which is complete farce, but can become real, because people can live up to it. People are moral agents, and they can compel their governments to act in decent ways, especially in democratic societies. As to the case of Bosnia, I'm not sure I understood exactly what you're saying, but in the case of Bosnia, you suggest that there's raison d'etat and appeasement. No, I misunderstood then, sorry.
I was suggesting that Wilsonian idealism had led to the aggregation of...
Oh, absolutely not.
Particularly religious...
Yeah, no, that's not what happened.
Which was kind of sooner or later.
No, I mean, it's Wilsonian idealism that led to the existence of countries like Czechoslovakia. I mean, Haiti is the word. But self-determination for nice, rich, white people led to, that's Wilsonian idealism, that led to countries like Czechoslovakia. Pretty nice place until the Germans and the Russians got after it. Yugoslavia also, which was, it's after the collapse of the communist tyranny, this tyrannical empire, that these places began to fall apart. Similar things happened when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. I mean, similar things happen when the European empires are collapsing. Take a look at what they leave behind them. I mean, take, say, Rwanda, where before the Belgians got in there were sort of differences between Hutu and Tutsi, but most people didn't even know what they were. In fact, the Belgians instituted those distinctions, and in fact, at one point even defined a Tutu as somebody who had more than some number of cattle. Okay, well, once the Europeans got through destroying the world and then pulled out, what they left behind them is total wreckage. So like when the British pulled out of Ghana, I think there were 99 university graduates. And, the country is a total wreck and owned by the West. Well, yeah, they have a lot of problems. So sure, that happens, and it's happening when Soviet tyranny broke down too, but this has nothing to do with Wilson or self-determination or anything else.
Next question is from Jim Dunn.
Jim Dunn, Foreign Affairs columnist with the Illawarra Mercury. I won't go over the Timor part, Professor Chomsky. But there is one thing I'd like to ask you about. When I was in Washington in 1977, which you may recall, I saw the then Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, Richard Holbrooke, who told me that as far as the United States was concerned, Indonesia, straddling as it did the Indian and Pacific Oceans, was of enormous strategic importance, with its oil of great economic importance and, of course, the biggest Muslim country. And he then said, and we believe the Suharto regime is the best of possible alternatives. And in the circumstances, there was nothing the United States would do to destabilize was the word he used, that regime. In the present situation, with President Clinton having been there for 2 years, I was in Washington myself a couple of months ago. I didn't get the impression that there'd been much change, but now that with the Republican victory in Congress, what chances are there that the United States will perhaps apply a little more pressure? And I just mention here, forgive me, that way back when I first raised East Timor, I was constantly being told privately by diplomats, ours and American, that the United States had enormous leverage in Jakarta, and it was the United States, less than Australia, that could have changed the course of events. So at this stage, what is likely to be done in Washington to change?
It's true that the United States has enormous leverage, not only in Jakarta, but everywhere. And there's obvious reasons for that. The usual reasons why the biggest mafia don has a lot of leverage. In the case of the strategic interest of Indonesia, it's a long story and there's no time to go, but we have a lot of declassified documents now, and they tell you what people were thinking. Way back in 1948, the State Department identified Indonesia as the major crisis area in what was called the struggle with the Kremlin. Struggle with the Kremlin is a technical word which means the struggle with independent nationalism. So that Indonesia was identified as the major crisis area in 1948. And remember, that was a pretty complicated era, but Indonesia was the major one. In 1958, just to go on, the National Security Council identified 3 major crisis areas. One was Indonesia, one was Algeria, and the other was the Levant. It was the time of the Iraq breakup of the fear of the oil system. Notice 3 Islamic countries, incidentally. And John Foster Dulles in the National Security Council meeting, since declassified, did say, in none of these areas are there any Kremlin plots. And when, meaning, no communists around. And when somebody said, well, maybe somebody else is doing their work for them, the notes of the meeting say that President Eisenhower vociferously supported Dulles' conclusions. That's 1958. By the early 60s, what was going on in Indonesia was very frightening. Again, the declassified record shows that the United States, as always, was mainly afraid of democracy in Indonesia. The main problem seemed to be that the PKI, the Mass Party, which was basically a party of the poor, that they were going to win any election. By the mid-50s, you look at the intelligence record and so on, the big fear is if there's ever an election, those guys are going to win. And they have the wrong conception of the national interest. It's a party that protects the poor. Actually, Dulles explained this rather neatly in a discussion with his brother, Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who was complaining, as Eisenhower did, that the communists always seem to appeal to the masses, something we can't duplicate. And John Foster Dulles said he said it's the poor people that they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. And somehow we can't get across our values, that the rich ought to plunder the poor, kind of like a PR problem they never were able to work out. Well, since you can't work out the PR problem, what you have to do is use our comparative advantage in violence. And that happened in 1965, as you well know. And it's kind of suppressed in the West, but worth looking at. I haven't checked Australia. Somebody else will have to do that. But I have reviewed the record in detail and in print, if you're interested, for the United States. And the slaughters, when they killed off about 500,000 people or whatever it was, that led to total euphoria. All across the press, left to right, complete euphoria. It was just the most wonderful thing that had ever happened, biggest bloodbath since the Holocaust. And there wasn't people protest in Congress. No aid group would send a cent. People just were falling all over each other to take more and more credit for having implemented it in private. The main criticism that, say, the New York Times had of the U.S. government was, in fact, they didn't have a criticism. They said what they called a staggering bloodbath. They described it with great glee. They said that it does raise critical questions for the United States, as New York Times editors. They said that the critical question is if the United States supports the generals too openly, it might harm them. But they said, thankfully, the U.S. had handled it right and had sort of pretended not to be involved, so therefore the critical questions were resolved. Well, and then, of course, Indonesia became an absolute paradise for investors. You could rob it at will, blocked only by corruption and so on. And, those are things that people don't forget easily. This was the major crisis area in the world, they thought. It was handled the right way, namely by neo-Nazi methods, with a huge bloodbath, which destroyed the only party of the poor, and hence eliminated the threat of democracy, and turned the country over to Western investors to rob. I mean, it's hard to improve on that. And so therefore, Richard Holbrooke was quite correct when he said that the United States regards this regime with great favor. Not everybody does favors like that. You also have to remember the context. This was the time when the United States was at war in Vietnam. And in fact, the standard reaction on the part of, say, Freedom House, big freedom human rights group, that big declaration saying that the Indonesian slaughter, they said, justified what the United States was doing in Vietnam, because it provided, as they said, a shield behind which the Indonesian generals were encouraged to sort of cleanse their society. In later years, last few years, in fact, McGeorge Bundy, who was then National Security Advisor, said that in retrospect, he thought the United States probably should have pulled out of Vietnam after the Indonesian massacres, because they had basically won the war. I mean, the war was fought to keep the infection, of independence from spreading to Indonesia, but now Indonesia was insulated from the infection, and the rest of the region was as well in similar ways, as you recall. Well, okay, that's the framework in which the invasion of East Timor took place. And of course, Richard Holbrooke and the rest were enthusiastically in support of it for that reason. Can this change under Clinton? Well, it's interesting to see what happened under Clinton. It's changed. I mean, as you recall what it was like in 1977 when we met, and what it's like now. It's very different. As the result of a lot of dedicated work, a few activists, church groups, others, there's a change. I mean, the press sort of covers it. I mean, they don't cover everything. Like the Timor Gap Treaty is yet to be mentioned, as far as I know. But there's uniform editorial denunciation. I mean, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial a couple of weeks ago in which they said that Indonesia should get the pebble out of their shoe. They picked that phrase. And that's the result of popular pressure. The pressure is across the spectrum. So it's not a left-right issue. In fact, some of the strongest people in Congress are on the far right, really far right, who've pressed very hard on this. It has absolutely nothing. It's not a political issue. It's a human issue. And it has nothing to do with where you stand on political matters. And the mood has changed. It changed enough so that Congress passed first legislation that banned training of military officers because of East Timor. That put the Clinton administration through some complicated maneuvers. They in fact announced, they very delicately selected the anniversary of the invasion to announce that the State Department would interpret the congressional legislation as meaning the opposite of what it said. That is, they said they would interpret it as meaning that the U.S. can continue to provide military training. And that aroused a lot of protest from Congress, from not Republican Democrat issue, it's across the board. Then came the ban against the weapons sales. The Clinton administration lobbied very hard to prevent that, and they managed to water it down, but something got through. And that's the way it goes. You just keep fighting, try to it's kind of disappointing that after all these years of work, when the United States is finally backing off from direct partnership in crime, Britain moves in, enthusiastically, Australia moves in, and so on. But, these are democratic societies. The same kind of thing can happen here, and in fact has, not should, but, and you just keep pressing, and sooner or later, the Indonesians, it's not Indonesians. I suspect most Indonesians, if they knew what was going on, would want them to get out tomorrow. I mean, the few Indonesians who do find out protest. But the Indonesian government, what's called Indonesia around here, the Indonesian government, sooner or later may take the Wall Street Journal's advice and get the pebble out of the shoe. It doesn't mean much to them. I mean, maybe it means a slightly different deal on what profit you get from oil or some other thing. But it's, these are not serious. I mean, these are not issues of the kind that justify slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people or letting your own country blow up. And that's why I think it's an easy case. It's not like Bosnia. You try to figure out what should be done in Bosnia. I mean, it's very hard to come up with a proposal. You don't, in this case, it's very easy to see what has to be done. It's mainly necessary for the accessories in crime, folks like us, to just back off. Actually, there's an old medical precept, goes back to the Hippocratic Oath, which says, first do no harm. Then you can start thinking of other things. Well, that's the one we ought to be paying attention to. Let's just stop doing harm, That may make the whole thing go away. And if not, it'll certainly set the stage for other possibilities.
Next question is from Hatumena.
Yes, I'm Hatumena from Antara News Agency. Regarding to the latest situation in Cambodia, what is your view about the political situation in Khmer Rouge, because you are known as one of Khmer Rouge defendants in the past time? Defenders.
That's very interesting fact.
Thank you.
It's true that I'm known as a Khmer Rouge defender, and if you look back at the reasons for that, you learn a lot about the issue of East Timor and the way Westerners treat it. Because what I actually wrote about it at the time, actually in the same UN testimony in the late 70s, is there's two major slaughters going on in the world. They seem to be comparable in scale. They're both gruesome and outrageous. They're in the same region. One is East Timor, one is Pol Pot's Cambodia. I said they look very similar, and they're being treated radically differently. One of them's being suppressed and downplayed and, lied and, apologetics and so on. The other is being brandished as a proof of how marvelous we are, and there's all kind of, invented this and that and the other thing. But what I said is they're the same, Now, to interpret that as support for the Khmer Rouge is extremely interesting. I mean, if it's support for the Khmer Rouge to say that it's comparable to what the Indonesians were doing in East Timor, namely the worst slaughter relative to the population since the Holocaust, what does that entail about the people who are drawing that conclusion? Well, think it through, tell something very obvious about it. Now, since they couldn't come right out and say that, what's happened is just an endless array of lies. I mean, of the kind that Stalin would have been impressed with. I'm glad to go through it if you like, but that's not really important. It's just a sign of the nature of the intellectual community. But the basic point that my co-author and I were making very explicitly, nothing hidden about it, you can read it and see, is here are two massive atrocities. We should tell the truth about them, and we should react to them. Now, in one case, the Timor one, it happened that there was a way for us to end it, namely by stopping our decisive support for it. In the case of the Khmer Rouge, nobody had a suggestion as to how to end it. So the first one was vastly more important on moral grounds. But that aside, I mean, they seem to be roughly comparable. And as far as I'm aware, not a single word that I ever wrote has ever been shown even marginally misleading, which is not very surprising because I didn't say a lot. I just said, look, here's the evidence. It looks more or less similar, and let's treat them honestly. That caused absolute outrage in the West. I mean, the idea that people should tell the truth and not just serve state power was considered absolutely outrageous. And the fact that I would compare a useful atrocity like Pol Pot, which is ideologically serviceable, to one that's ideologically dysfunctional, like one we're involved in, that was considered absolutely outrageous. And that tells us quite a lot about Western intellectual culture. And that's the sense in which I'm a defender of the Khmer Rouge. Right? As for the current situation, well, what happened actually is that, again, this is kind of like suppressed in the West, but, people should be able to find out about it. There was finally a way to end the Khmer Rouge atrocities, it turned out. The Vietnamese invaded. Okay, that ended the Khmer Rouge atrocities. Then they became the bad guys. Meanwhile, the West started supporting the Khmer Rouge. In fact, pretty openly. So I think it may have been Richard Holbrooke or somebody from the State Department, I've forgotten, about in the early 80s was asked why in congressional testimony, was asked why is the United States opposing the resistance in East Timor but supporting the Khmer Rouge, Democratic Kampuchea as it was called, which everybody knew was the Khmer Rouge. And his response was, this is the official U.S. government position, his response was that we have to support DK, Democratic Kampuchea, with the Khmer Rouge forces, because of its continuity with the Pol Pot regime. That was the State Department position. We support them because of their continuity with the Pol Pot regime. On the other hand, the Timorese resistance can't claim any such authenticity. And in fact, the press was pretty open. Like the New York Times said, well, hurts our delicate sensibilities, but we have to support the Khmer Rouge forces because that's the only way to bring the Vietnamese to, compromise, meaning do what we want. In fact, it's amazing. If you look even at the studies, the CIA, for example, has a demographic study, the comprehensive demographic study in which they tried to review what happened in the 70s. The press has been unwilling to comment on this because it's too embarrassing. But here's what it says. You can get it, I'm sure. You must have it here. It came out around 1980. It was very highly recommended by the highest State Department officials, including the current ambassador. They conclude that the number of people killed by the Khmer Rouge, was 50 to 100,000, which is totally ridiculous. They suppress all of the massacres in 77 and 78. They say the massacres ended around 77, which is total nonsense. The worst ones were in 78. And they say that most Cambodians didn't suffer very much. And in fact, that's been the position of major U.S. government scholars, like, say, Douglas Pike, a year later. Scholar said he describes Pol Pot as a charismatic leader who carried out a successful peasant revolution in which, relatively speaking, most Cambodians didn't suffer. The CIA says the so-called old people, the ones in the countryside, they did pretty well. In fact, they claim that that the population actually increased. Well, what's the reason for all this nonsense? It's been discussed by a scholar who's well known here, Michael Vickery, Cambodia scholar, who gave the plausible explanation, namely that by early 78, the Carter administration was carrying out what was called a tilt toward China. They were shifting around their position, and that led them indirectly to supporting the Khmer Rouge. So therefore, the retrospective justifications are, well, maybe it was kind of bad in the beginning, but, then it got really better when we shifted to supporting them, as we shifted to support them right through the 80s. This is one of the most cynical policies there is. John Pilger is one of many who've exposed it. And again, the intellectuals have to suppress that. So when they talk about apologetics for the Khmer Rouge, they don't cite the CIA demographic study, and they don't cite Douglas Pike, the leading U.S. government scholar, because they really are apologists for the Khmer Rouge, but that doesn't sound good. So what about the current situation? Right now it's a real mess. I don't know what to say. Now there's just, I don't know if you can prove it, but I don't think anybody who looks has very much doubt that the Khmer Rouge are very much in league with Thai businessmen and Thai generals, and stuff's flowing in through there, and the West is kind of tacitly backing it, and so on and so forth. And how you deal with that, I have no idea. If I had a proposal, I'd make it, but I don't have a proposal.
Next question, I'm afraid, will have to be the last. It's from Tim Dodd.
Professor Chomsky, I'm Tim Dodd from the Financial Review newspaper, and you're a caustic, a critic of secrecy and conspiratorial attitudes on the part of government. But can you take us beyond this negative appraisal and offer some practical principles for reform? Or in other words, is there a form of government which you believe is deserving of our trust?
I think that's several different. First of all, I don't accuse anybody of conspiratorial behavior. Conspiracy is a funny word. It's used. We don't talk about it as conspiracy when we say that the Politburo met and decided to do something. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just rational analysis. The term conspiracy is used to try to undercut rational analysis of our own planning system. So there's nothing conspiratorial about the fact that U.S. planners decided to do something. That's their job. It's not conspiratorial. They have a commitment to keep the public from knowing, and that's understandable too. In fact, to a substantial extent, the media have the same commitment. I've documented it quite substantially. And it's fear of democracy, primarily. I think that's what lies behind it. But then, turn to your point, are there practical proposals, and is there a form of government we can trust? There are plenty of practical proposals. In fact, I've been talking about practical proposals in one case, and we can go case by case and find lots of cases of practical proposals. They all ultimately rely on the same thing. People, human beings, can figure out what their values are, and they're usually pretty much the same. And then they can ask how they can pressure the various systems of authority in which they live to act in accordance with those principles. Now, we're pretty lucky. These are free and democratic societies, so you can pressure systems of authority without ending up in a ditch cut to pieces and, after hideous torture. So we're lucky. We have all sorts of ways of doing it. Other people aren't so lucky. They have harder ways of doing it, and they try. And, it's astonishing that they do more than we do under our easy circumstances. So, like, say, George Adejandro has a much harder time than we do, but he's outspoken, When you ask, is there a form of government we can trust? No, by definition. There is no form of authority that ever ought to be trusted, You don't, and that ought to be second nature. You don't trust authority. What you do is challenge authority. You ask authority to justify itself. Well, maybe sometimes it can justify itself. If so, okay. If it can't, dismantle it. But certainly don't trust it. You don't trust anybody but yourself.
Despite what I did.
Do you want to do any more?
Sure.
Just despite what I just said to you, we have prized a little more time out, so there is possibly room for a couple more questions.
5 minutes.
Yeah, Professor Chomsky does have fixed travel plans. He has to be in Melbourne tonight. He has to leave here within the next 10 minutes. But we had another question scheduled, and it was from Jeff Barker. So do your best, Jeffrey.
Jeffrey Barker from the Financial Review. Professor, given that powerful governments respond to their perceived economic and security interests in a world governed by force, are there any positive incentives that might be offered to the Australian government that could persuade it to behave in a more principled way in relation to Indonesia? In short, is there a way to persuade a state to behave morally in a Hobbesian world?
Sure, and people do it all the time, people do it all the time. The case of what happened in the United States is an example. They didn't do it because they decided they were nice guys, the United States, these security interests, first of all, are mostly fraud. Economic interests are real, but they're not the economic interests of the population. Adam Smith was quite right about that, and nothing's changed since except that we have more evidence. As far as the people of Indonesia are concerned, they got their own interests. Of Australia are concerned. They have their own interests. What kind of a world do they want to live in? What kind of a society do they want to live in? Do they want to live in a society where you kill a couple 100,000 people because maybe some oil company can make a little more money? All right, that's a question you ask yourself, and you find out what your values are. If your values happen to be what everybody's are, for the most part, then you can act in many ways to change what governments do. It happens all the time. I know the United States much better, so let me talk about the United States. Let me just take a dramatic case, much more dramatic than this one. In 1961, John F. Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to attack South Vietnam. Up until then, it had just been a kind of Latin American-style terror state, where the state security forces are supposed to murder people, and they had already killed maybe 100,000 people, kind of Latin American style. But it was getting out of hand. They couldn't control the population. So Kennedy simply determined that the United States should carry out a war crime. It should invade South Vietnam, which is exactly what happened. The U.S. Air Force was sent, true, under Vietnamese markings, but it didn't fool anybody, and even the press reported it. The U.S. pilots were carrying out about 30% of the bombing of civilian targets. Napalm was authorized. Crop destruction and defoliation were authorized. There weren't any North Vietnamese, incidentally, no Russians, no Chinese, nothing. South Vietnamese is what they were attacking. That's just a war against South Vietnam. Very much like the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and then it blew up into a war against the whole of Indochina. Well, when that happened in 1961, it wasn't a secret. The details weren't known. By now we know the details because everything's been declassified. But the general contours were known. You could even read it in the press. You couldn't get two people together in a living room to talk about it. Nobody cared. We want to go bomb another country, kill civilians. Fine, I don't care. I'm doing something else. Well, that changed. changed quite radically. It incidentally did not change very much among educated sectors. Now, they're about where they were. But among the general population, it changed radically. I mean, the U.S. government can't possibly do anything like that. That's why in 1980, the Reaganites, in 81, when the Reaganites came in, you could see that they were trying to duplicate their hero, Kennedy, almost point by point. They came out with the same white paper, the same lies, everything, but they were aiming then at Central America. And they had to back off. The press went along. The press said, yeah, let's kill them, and so on and so forth. But the population just rose up, There were protests all over the place, and they backed off. They backed off, and they turned to clandestine warfare. Well, clandestine warfare is, a country turns to clandestine warfare when it's afraid of its own population. Clandestine warfare is less efficient, it's, more problematic. It's much easier to send B-52s. You don't have to lie, it works better, and so on and so forth. Countries turn to clandestine warfare when they're afraid of their own people. Same reason for government secrecy. So the U.S. set up by far the biggest international terror network in history, hiring terrorist states, in fact, not individual terrorists, to attack Central America. And they managed to kill a couple 100,000 people. It was to a large extent a war against the church, and destroyed a bunch of countries, but there was a big protest, much more than in the 60s, and they just couldn't carry off what they wanted. Well, that's a change. It's change in the population, and those changes in the population necessarily change policy. That's certainly true in relatively free and democratic societies. In fact, if we were honest, we would recognize it's even true of totalitarian states. Even totalitarian states have to worry about their own population. Like, take, say, Nazi Germany. It's about as far as you can get. If you read Albert Speer's memoirs, the economic minister, he makes an interesting point there. He says that Nazi Germany was never able to move as towards pure totalitarianism to the extent that the democratic societies were. So the democratic societies could construct real command economies with real wage controls and everybody working and Rosie the Riveter and all this kind of stuff. And the reason they could do it was because in the democratic societies, people were committed to the war. And they were going to do it. They wanted to win, But the German government never trusted its own population. So they had to kind of buy them off. They had to carry out what Lyndon Johnson called a guns and butter war, buy off the population while you keep fighting. And Speer's analysis, and he's in a position to know, is that may have set back the German war effort by maybe a year, which could have been the difference between victory and defeat, if you remember what was happening at the end. Well, that's what happens in a totalitarian state. They got to worry about their population too. Same was true of Russia. You got to placate people. That's why the Indonesian government keeps secrecy. And in a freer society, it's perfectly obvious, what you can do. And it's done all the time. That's why we don't live under slavery, that's why we have whatever rights we have, because people force changes, not because they trusted governments.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. I should tell everybody that although we prized a little extra time today, he does have to leave. He does have fixed travel commitments. He told me before lunch that there are rare occasions, particularly on public demonstrations, where he wears a tie. So we decided that our tradition of giving first-time speakers a National Press Club tie fitted exactly with that. I hope it protects you from whatever it is that you're next publicly protesting against. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.